the problem was that it was more generated subjectively. We can assume that. That is, it was based on the leaders or one leader. And so a lot of different organizations then were competing to who was the most vanguard, who was the most militant or the most radical. But the good thing about it is that even though we were competing, there was a certain amount of mutual recognition. No? We're working with the Chicano community, you're working with the black community, SDS was working with the white community, AIM was working with the indigenous community, and we're all equal, but you work your street and we'll work ours. That kind of arrangement, no? But it was still based on this pulling the people to action, like you're actually pulling this big boxcar, you know? Like this big weight, heavy weightlifting. And so how long can somebody do that? And based on what conditions? And what happens when you've been pulling that wagon along that big train for years and then all the conditions change? Then we kind of criticized that when the movement was really picking up, there was a big populist upsurge during the Vietnam War, and, you know, marches of 100,000 people were big at that time. And you know, the Poor People's Campaign to Washington with Martin Luther King, all of these things were big. I mean, but it was based on this sort of, not the one leader, but still the one leader, but more like the symbolic leader, and then more of a populist movement. And so you needed the one sort of, so when the newspapers wanted to, the police killed somebody, the police killed, or, you know, well, not the police, but somebody killed 10 children in Atlanta. Remember when they were kidnapping, killing the children? Well, who would they call? Who would the news call? They would call whoever the symbolic leader in that community was. So that leader became the leader for all the time. You know, even if they wanted to not be the leader, the media and other people would call them. You know, like, this is happening. And so we would respond to that. But there was a certain amount of synergy, of energy and momentum that you would pick up. But there was a certain amount of sort of a glass ceiling. You got to a certain point, and it seemed like you couldn't get beyond in terms of developing new leaders, because then it always sort of became the contradiction between the one leader and then developing new leadership in the cadre, and the people that were doing the work. And so it became conflicted. And then when we came into the 80s, there was a big change in around 79 and 80. There was a sort of a change of era. So a lot of those liberation identity movements collapsed, sort of imploded. I mean, yes, there was a COINTELPRO infiltrations and repression. Yes, there's been assassinations of some of the leaders. There's been a lot of different things. So it wasn't just that in and by itself it imploded, but it didn't get crushed by the system. It imploded because of that moment that was changing, and we couldn't make the change. We didn't have the analysis, and we were still stuck in the liberation movement the way we had worked it in the 70s and the 60s. So we couldn't see beyond this. Obviously the right wing did see beyond that, because they saw what we were doing, and then 79, 80 came the Republican right revolution with Newt Gingrich and all of those clowns, no? So they started moving to get Ronald Reagan into office. When Ronald Reagan came into office, we didn't know whether we'd all be rounded up and put in concentration camps. That was not a fool's idea. That was real. There was a real possibility, and there were designs for that, although they might have not been carried out to that extent, but there were a lot of the nonprofits and community organizations were thinking that they're going to come down on us. So a lot of groups, instead of like just organizing, the political organizing actually went into the community. Not that these movements were not in the community, they were organizing in the community, but we have become more left, more radical. The right came in, took over that space. Then we had to react to the Reaganism and the Central American wars, the Contras, and all of that. So there was a big fragmentation of the movement at that time. A lot of the old liberation movements and organizations didn't make that crossover. They got left behind. So what happened here is that a whole sort of new process starts that is based more on issues. Environmental justice, environmental racism became a big issue. Coming here out of the South in terms of Wharton County, I believe, or where some of the first people started laying down on the road to stop the trucks from coming in, and that started in many, many places around not just environmental justice, health, you know, all kinds of rights, anything that you can imagine basically came into issue-based. The problem is that the issue-based was a lot more organizations, but they kind of traveled in parallel lines. And so in the late 80s, we were talking about the problem with the issue-based organizing, that it was good, it was bringing in new people into the movement, it was educating them in a way that they might have not been ready for liberation, but they were definitely ready to fight the incinerator in the South Bronx, or, you know, like on and on and on, no? Or in Detroit and all of that. So, and so part of this whole thing was that, well, since we have all these parallel lines, we ought to have some kind of intersectionality. That was sort of the big word, having intersection between issues. But it was still sort of a mechanical way of bringing the issues together to create sort of partnerships, but not necessarily based on a new analysis of what this issue-based organizing was and where we were at in the sort of plotted in the map. Then we had, coming into the 2000s, we had the mega marches. Of course, we had 2001, and we'll be looking more at a timeline with a lot more detail. Right now, I'm just putting there was a setbacks of 9/11 in 2001, where a lot of the movement lost a lot of ground that, you know, we had gained in all of this movement. When we lost the ground in about 2003, we started regaining some of that ground. And some of that came together in 2006 with the mega marches. Not only 2006, but around that time. Remember the Million Men March in Washington? The Million Women March also in Washington? And there was 1 million people, you know. Then you had the big marches of the migrants in 2006, and where something like 5 million people marched. But how many of those millions did we sign up as members in our organization, or in this new organization? We created a new one. We should have ended up with at least, you know, even if half of those millions would have signed up, we would have ended up with at least 4 million members, a movement of 4 million people. So we have to ask ourselves what happened. Well, one is that it was populist. You know, we went with a populist sort of activism. activism versus organizing. Because we put in more of our activism hat. We were happy to see all those people out there, their faces reflected liberation, power, color, in the streets, and we forgot about the organizing. And in the end of the day, all of that water just went right through our fingers because we didn't keep any of that organizing, unfortunately. And so that, happens when you have a very populist sort of upsurge. You think, well, it's going to change everything, and if there's no organizing, what happens to that populist movement is that it will collapse. And it has happened in the past, no? And so we have to think about it, like, I'm not saying these are the models, but we need to begin to really finalize on which are the models that have taken place so that we can begin to agree what has worked and what hasn't in real terms. No? Then we came into this new sort of concept coming into after 2003. After 2003, there was also a change of sort of a change of epoch, of era. So it went more from the committee around environmental racism, or the committee on this, or the coalition on this, into more mass organizing. And as the mass organizing developed, and we started talking about movement building and creating more alliances or networks, coalitions, different things like those, then it began to weigh on us that we were very good at developing a lot of structure immediately, but we were very bad at discussing what was the political moment that we were living. When we went to Detroit, the political moment that we're living there, just to give you an example, is that we were talking about another world is possible, another U.S. is necessary, with the background of a decaying Detroit, which was the capitalist, shining city, at one time. So if you juxtapose those and look at what has happened in the capitalist world and what has happened in the movement, we've come, a long ways. So the whole process of when we went to the World Social Forum, and we can talk in detail about that, but we learned about this concept of the open space and what was it. And if we think about it as sort of like, I like the, the astronomy and all that. So it's kind of like a black hole in space, and it draws in all of the matter that is flowing around it. It has a way of drawing into that vacuum all of this movement around it. So that's basically the concept that was developed for the World Social Forum as a mechanism to bring in a lot more people, a lot more movements from across the globe or across the country, in our case, into a process that was an open space that would, one, by bringing in all these forces into it that were of equal standing, it created convergence. So convergence becomes a very important word, an organizing word, in terms of bringing all those movements together. Those mass movements, whether it be at a social forum, or whether it be at a People's Movement Assembly, or it be at a big march, how we then begin to measure that in terms of the level and capacity of convergence. Okay? And this means bringing different organizations that may or may not work together, or have not worked together. And this allows for that to happen. And nobody necessarily owns it. And nobody organizes it top down so that it's got to be this way, this is the political line, and if you don't like it, don't.